Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are wrestling with a really critical issue. The huge cybersecurity challenge with connected medical devices, CMDs.
Massive.
Yeah, and the stakes are incredibly high. Think about, like, the worst-case scenario. We're not just talking data breaches.
No, far beyond that.
Imagine someone hacking a connected insulin pump. They could change the dose, directly harming the patient.
Yeah, worse, potentially.
Or maybe using that same pump as like a backdoor for a huge ransomware attack on the whole hospital network, shutting down life support. It's terrifyingly direct.
It really is, and that's exactly why the regulatory side is under such intense scrutiny right now. So for you listening, especially if you're in the regulatory or risk management space in medtech,
Which many of you are.
exactly, we're doing a critical, maybe even a bit provocative deep dive today. We're looking squarely at the two big pre-market cybersecurity guidance documents.
The main ones.
The main ones globally. The EU's MDCG 2019-16, the revised version, and the US FDA's Cybersecurity and Medical Devices Guidance.
Okay, and our main source here is an academic study comparing these two. And it seems like they didn't hold back.
Not at all. Straight out of the gate, they hit hard. The core finding, and I'm quoting here, is that both documents are inadequately formulated in certain aspects, have an unclear scope, inconsistent levels of detail, and contain thematic gaps.
Wow. Okay, inadequately formulated.
Yeah.
That's strong language when you're talking about major regulatory guidance.
It is. It's not saying the effort wasn't there, but it really questions the effectiveness, the actual output.
Right.
So our mission today is to really understand where these documents line up, where they differ, and crucially, where those gaps are. The gaps that could be causing risk, ambiguity, confusion for manufacturers trying to comply.
Okay, let's definitely unpack this. Where do we start? Maybe with how the researchers even reached that conclusion. They must have compared them against something.
They did, yeah. It was quite systematic. First, they built a baseline, a kind of benchmark framework for what good device cybersecurity requirements should look like.
And this wasn't just their opinion.
No. Very much grounded in existing standards. They pulled high-level requirements from well-known international standards and best practices. Think BSI, OWASP, NIST, the big names.
Okay. The established players?
Right. They organized all these best practices into 12 main themes. Things like cryptography, network security, risk management, secure software development.
Yeah.
The core pillars.
The kind of gold standard checklist?
Essentially, yes. And then they meticulously went through the MDCG guidance and the FDA guidance, mapping every single requirement against their 12 themes.
Grading the homework, basically. So before we get into the failing grades, did anything actually get a pass? What did the MDCG and FDA actually agree and cover things well?
Yeah, there were definitely areas of convergence, places where you can see a global consensus forming.
Good. Like what?
Both documents did a pretty decent job covering basic things like passwords. Also, practical steps like testing and the overall process of risk management, those were reasonably well covered.
Okay, so the fundamentals are there, at least in part.
Sort of. But that also means the bigger problems, the thematic gaps the study mentioned, lie in maybe more technical, implementation-focused areas.
Right. Let's get into those weaknesses then. Based on that comparison, where did the EU's MDCG guidance 2019-16 show the biggest gaps?
The MDCG had some pretty significant shortfalls, particularly in really core technical areas. The study pointed to major gaps in authentication and access control.
Critical.
Yeah. Also cryptography, and maybe most concerningly, source code and software development principles.
Wait, source code. If the guidance is vague on secure coding, that's huge.
A major concern, right? It kind of suggests the EU guidance is maybe stronger on the process, the documentation, the risk management framework, but weaker on the specific technical controls developers need to actually build into the software securely.
That puts a massive burden on the manufacturer, doesn't it? To figure out what secure enough actually means for code and crypto if the guidance is fuzzy.
Exactly. It creates ambiguity. Now, what about the US side? The FDA guidance, FDA Cyber. Where were its weak spots?
Does it fare better?
Slightly better overall in thematic coverage, yes. But it still only partially covered key areas like data protection and privacy, resilience, meaning how the device handles attacks or failures, and third-party components.
Okay, still gaps though.
Still gaps. But here's a really interesting one the study flagged for the FDA. A relative neglect of specific network security principle.
Network security.
Yeah.
For connected devices. That seems fundamental.
Right. especially when you consider the FDA does put quite a bit of focus on third-party software components.
Hmm.
You really can't separate the risk of a third-party component from how the device interacts with the network. They're intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a definite red flag for anyone managing supply chain risk. Okay, let's dig into that FDA data point you mentioned earlier. They limited secure data requirements at rest, transit, use only to sensitive data. Why do researchers see that limited scope as a gap?
Well, because attackers aren't only interested in obviously sensitive data like patient health information or, credit card numbers. Limiting security focus just to sensitive data leaves a lot of other potentially useful information exposed. Think about device metadata, system logs, maybe patient scheduling info that doesn't have direct PHI, configuration files.
Stuff that seems harmless, but could be useful to an attacker.
Precisely. A hacker might not need PHI to cause damage. They could use those non-sensitive logs or config files to understand the network, find a vulnerability in some other component, or just move laterally inside the hospital network to launch a much bigger attack, like ransomware.
Oh, okay. So that limitation creates a potential blind spot.
A potentially significant one, yeah.
Okay, hearing the MDCG is vague on things like authentication and secure code, and the FDA maybe underplays network security. It does sound concerning. Let's circle back to the MDCG structure itself. You mentioned an inconsistency there. How helpful is it really in guiding secure technical design?
Yeah, the MDCG document has this sort of internal conflict that can be frustrating for manufacturers. When it talks about high-level ideas, concepts like secure design or defense in depth, the text is often quite superficial.
How so?
It introduces the principle, says it's important, but then often fails to provide concrete methods, specific technical requirements, or even useful references to standards like OWASP that would tell a developer how to actually achieve that secure design.
So it tells you what, but not how.
Often, yes. But here's the weird part, the anomaly the study highlighted. In stark contrast to that technical vagueness, the MDCG is actually highly detailed when it comes to requirements for user instructions and device documentation.
Wait, so they specify exactly what needs to be in the manual you give the user, or the paperwork for the notified body.
Down to fine points.
But they're vague on how to build the actual product securely.
That sounds backwards.
Yeah.
Almost like regulatory box ticking over real security.
One could certainly interpret it that way. For a manufacturer trying to plan their design, budget resources, architect the system, you know exactly what paperwork you need to produce, but you get much less specific, measurable guidance on the technical security specs for the device itself. And does this vagueness cause problems in practice? Like with getting devices approved. I'm thinking about that point on penetration testing.
Absolutely, that's a prime example. Penetration tests, or pen tests, they're only listed as a recommendation in the actual text of the MDCG guidance.
Just recommended, not required.
Technically, yes. But in practice, many, if not most, EU-notified bodies treat them as a de facto requirement during conformity assessment. So if you're managing risk and budget, you've got this gap between the official guidance saying recommendation and the practical reality where it's basically expected. That creates huge uncertainty about timelines, costs. It's an unnecessary ambiguity.
Okay, let's swing back to the FDA guidance. You said it performed a bit better overall. What are its main structural strengths, especially compared to the MDCG?
The FDA guidance really stands out in a couple of ways. First, it does a much clearer job explicitly linking device security directly to patient safety. It frames cybersecurity not as just an IT issue, but as a fundamental part of device safety throughout its lifecycle.
That's a good framing. What else?
Second, its handling of third-party software components, which, as we know, are huge sources of risk, is much more detailed and better articulated than in the MDCG. Specifically, the FDA is clearer and more forceful on the need for a software bill of materials, an SBOM.
Right, the SBOM. Can you just quickly remind us why having a detailed SBOM requirement is so important for practical risk management?
Sure. An SBOM is basically a list, an inventory of all the software pieces inside a device, commercial libraries, open source code, proprietary stuff, everything.
Like an ingredients list for software?
Exactly. So when a major vulnerability pops up, like remember Log4j?
Oh, yeah. Chaos.
Right. With an SBOM, the manufacturer and potentially the hospital using the device can immediately check, is this vulnerable component present in our devices? The FDA's clearer requirement pushes manufacturers to map out that supply chain risk proactively. That's a big win for managing security after the device is already out there.
Okay, so we've established both guides have strengths, both have weaknesses, thematic gaps, inconsistencies. But here's the really critical question, I think. Would actually following these guides strictly prevent the kind of real-world attacks we hear about? This leads to the second big finding from the study, doesn't it?
It does. And this is where the picture gets a bit more nuanced, maybe pushing back against just saying the guidance is inadequate, full stop.
How so?
The researchers looked at the top 10 most impactful publicly known vulnerabilities, the CVEs, common vulnerabilities and exposures that have actually affected medical devices out in the wild.
Yeah, real problem.
Real problems. And they found that for most of these major CVEs, the necessary mitigation measures, the ways to prevent or fix them, are already covered in the existing guidance documents. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but the answers are generally there.
Huh. Okay, so wait. If the guidance does cover how to prevent the worst-known vulnerabilities, what does that really mean for the industry? Is the problem less about missing rules and more about, well, manufacturers not following them properly?
That seems to be the core conclusion, yes. And it puts a heavy weight on compliance teams. The study basically says the mere existence of guidance, even imperfect guidance, isn't enough. Manufacturers have to actually do the things mentioned, diligently implement those security principles.
So if a known vulnerability, one with a fix suggested in the guidance, still shows up in a device on the market,
Then the issue looks less like a policy gap and more like an implementation failure or maybe an enforcement issue. It's about the rigor of the development and compliance process.
let's drill into that implementation failure idea.
Mm-hmm.
What about the common coding flaws, the CWEs, common weakness enumerations that the researchers flagged? This is where the MDCG's vagueness might really bite.
It really does seem to. Well, again, the FDA guidance generally fares a bit better here. The study found the MDCG covers about 5 common types of weaknesses, only implicitly, not directly.
And the key example they gave.
The critical one they highlighted was CWE 798, the use of hard-coded credentials. This is a classic basic security flaw. But the MDCG text only explicitly says manufacturers should avoid hard-coded passwords. It doesn't explicitly say avoid hard-coded credentials more broadly.
Okay, for listeners, why is that distinction between password and credential so vital, and why is CWE 798 so bad?
Hard-coded credentials mean some secret key, maybe a universal password for maintenance, maybe an API key for debugging, is literally embedded directly into the device's software code.
Baked right in.
Baked right in. So if just one device is compromised or if someone reverse engineers the software, they find that key. And because it's hard-coded, it's the same key potentially for every single device of that model out there.
Giving them universal access.
Universal, often unchangeable access. It's a catastrophic flaw. It really should be caught in any basic secure development life cycle. The fact that the MDCG is only explicit about passwords could theoretically allow a manufacturer using, say, hard-coded API keys to argue they're technically compliant even though they've violated the spirit of secure design. It's a dangerous loophole.
It's genuinely alarming that such basic, easily avoidable mistakes like hard-coded credentials or, giving software too many privileges are still found in medical devices on the market today. If the current guidance, with its inconsistencies, isn't quite closing this implementation gap, what did the study authors suggest as a better way forward? A structural fix?
They argued that the root problem is that inconsistent level of detail we've been discussing. It makes the guidance try to be 2 things at once, high-level principles and specific technical instructions, and it doesn't do either perfectly.
So what's the fix?
Structural separation. They propose future guidance should split things up, have one high-level document that lays out the fundamental, enduring security principles, the North Star, if you will.
Okay, the core philosophy.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then have separate, more detailed documents that specify implementation practices for different types of devices.
Device-specific guidance. That makes a lot of sense, doesn't it? The security needs for a big hospital MRI machine must be totally different from, say, a disposable Bluetooth glucose monitor patch.
Totally different. That separation would allow the high-level principles document to remain stable and relevant for longer. Meanwhile, the detailed technical guidance for specific categories, maybe implantables or web-connected diagnostic systems or mobile medical apps, could be updated much more frequently and flexibly.
Keeping pace with technology and threats?
Precisely. Reflecting how fast things change in specific areas without needing to overhaul the entire guidance structure every couple of years.
Okay, so let's bring this all together for our listeners in regulatory and risk roles. The takeaway seems to be, yes, the current MDCG and FDA guidance docs are imperfect. They have unclear scope sometimes, thematic gaps, annoying inconsistencies.
Definitely room for improvement.
But the analysis also suggests they do actually cover the fixes for most of the big known vulnerabilities and weaknesses, the CVEs and CWEs, that cause real harm. The guidance might be implicit sometimes, maybe not perfectly structured, but the core technical direction is often there.
Which puts the spotlight firmly back on implementation and perhaps enforcement.
Right. And that leads perfectly into the final provocative thought for you, our listener. The EU's medical device regulation, the MDR, specifically Article 113, already talks about potential penalties for non-compliance.
It does lay the groundwork.
So, given that we know easily preventable flaws like hard-coded credentials still persist in devices reaching the market, should regulatory authorities in the EU member states start thinking about supplementing the existing rules? Maybe with specific, clearly defined, enforceable fines for what constitutes gross negligence in security development.
Moving beyond just warnings or market withdrawal.
Yeah. A real financial penalty tied directly to failing to implement basic, known security controls outlined, even implicitly, in the guidance. Could that be the nudge needed to force stricter adherence across the board?
That certainly would change the risk calculation for manufacturers, wouldn't it? If the cost of noncompliance, the actual financial penalty, starts to demonstrably outweigh the cost of doing security properly from the start.
We might finally see the kind of consistent, diligent security this critical sector absolutely needs. Something to definitely think about. Thank you for this deep dive today.
My pleasure. Always important discussions.